Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Kate's independent media production. Today, we are diving again into the DIY rabbit hole with taking my old busted tambourine and making our own jingle rings. There are a lot of options on the market for things that tambourine-ify your snare drum or cymbals, different things like that. And while they are all super awesome, we really like making our own stuff here just for the opportunity to experiment with sound and just sort of see where our ears take us versus just buying product after product and sort of looking for something that suits the sound that we're after. Depending on what you're looking for, something you find might be too loud or too soft or feel weird when you hit the drum or the cymbal or something like that. So if there's opportunities for us to take our own path and actually find a sound that we love, that's always worth experimenting with. The origin story of today's experiment is that my old wood tambourine that I've had for a really long time unfortunately got crushed in a road case while I was traveling, and I looked at it and thought, well, the thing I liked about this tambourine was the sound of the jingles, so there's got to be something that we can do with this rather than just throwing it in the trash. The first and maybe only thing that came to mind to me was that I didn't really have a lot of options for jingle rings for myself that were actually snare drum sized. I have a few that go on the hi-hat. We have a few here at the studio that are larger that do great things for us, but once upon a time I had one that was actually mounted on a soft plastic ring, and I used to use it on my floor tom and the snare drum, and it was a lot of fun. I haven't had it for years, and I realized that in front of me and in my tool drawer I had everything that I needed to make it, so we decided to run down that today. All right, first things first, let's run down all the things we're going to need in order to do this. Thing number one is we need an E-ring, something like this that basically is where we're going to mount our tambourine jingles. We've chosen a 2-inch wide so that there's enough room to really get them centered in the ring. If your rings are narrower than this, you can move them closer to the edge. This is what we use today. Thing two you're going to need is the jingles that used to be in this tambourine that's definitely super dead. You can also order jingles online. There are a lot of options for that, different varieties, things of that nature. You can kind of choose your own adventure with that, but suffice to say, they're not super expensive. Metals, different kinds of metals. There's a lot of possibilities there. Number three is the piece that we're using to mount the jingles to the ring. It's a piece called a cotter pin, and it's really small. You can get them at the hardware store. I think these were 20 cents a piece. And it's basically just a way to fasten the jingles to the ring in a way that you can undo if you want to change it. It's not permanent, and all you need to put them in is basically just a pair of pliers. So obviously you also need a pair of pliers. And we're going to need something to put a hole in the E-ring. Obviously, we don't need a power drill to drill a hole in what is basically a piece of a drum head. Thinking that maybe just a standard kind of hole punch that you would find at any office store or classroom would definitely do the job perfectly well. It turned out with all of these tools that we have, we don't actually have a hole punch, so we did have to use the power drill. A couple of tool honorable mentions that we used today as well is that we used a 10-inch hoop for our 14-inch jingle ring just to sort of loosely mark where we wanted to put our 6 jingles as a little bit of a guide. We just set it in the center and marked with a marker on the E-ring. And secondly, if you have one or if you want to, we used a straight edge to make sure that we were putting our drill point right in the center of the span of the E-ring. It's not mandatory, but it does make it look a little bit more professional. It is also worth noting that if you're using a narrower E-ring, if you're maybe putting one on a tom or something and it's only 1 inch across, we do have to make sure, again, that the tambourine jingles are basically inside of the outer edge, just like we did on the snare drum, because that is the edge that's going to fit on the head. So if they extend past it, they're going to end up resting on the hoop, and you're going to have lots of sort of sonic problems there. We're going to go ahead and use our smaller hoop to mark the locations where we're going to put our jingles. We're choosing to use the number that is the number of lugs on this hoop, so it makes it super duper easy, and we're just going to mark them with a marker, Sharpie, whatever you want to use. The next thing we need to do is drill the holes where we marked them. We're going to use a straight edge to make sure in this case, because it's a wider E-ring, that we're getting them in the center of the ring, which is going to make sure that they're not bumping into the hoop, and that also we're not getting too close to the inside to where we could have a tear or something like that. Now that we've got all of our holes drilled, it's time to start mounting the jingles to the ring. A very crucial part of this process is making sure that we pair the jingles correctly. That means that they are not nested inside of each other, but rather they are inverted so that you basically have what looks like two little china cymbals touching each other on the bow. This will ensure that they jingle against each other and don't cancel each other out when you're hitting the drum. Now that we've got them married correctly, it's time to insert the cotter pin through the pair and then insert that through the E-ring. Once we've put it through the E-ring, it's time to bend the legs of the cotter pin so that it won't slide back out. We want to make sure to bend the legs at as close to a 90-degree angle as possible so that the pin will lay as flat against the head as we can possibly make it. This will ensure that the jingle ring lays as flush as possible to the head and we get the maximum amount of energy transfer so that the jingles get activated when we strike the drum. One of the great things about using cotter pins for this as opposed to a rivet or something like that is that there's a lot of vertical play along it, so you can really get a lot of dynamic response from the jingles depending on how softly or aggressively you're striking the drum. It makes it a little bit more interactive of an instrument. As a baseline comparison today, it doesn't really make sense for us to compare this sound to a wide open drum, so we're going to use as a baseline a regular E-ring of the same size without the jingles to give you an idea of what we're starting with before the addition of the jingles. Let's hear how that sounds. And now, the same ring, but with the jingles added. What we both initially loved about this is that it's a little more subtle and also a little more dynamic than a lot of things like this that we've used here before, and it lends itself to a lot more things than just suddenly having a ton of tambourine in your backbeat sound. Because it's just a ring and not covering the entire head, the rim shot sound is totally usable and sounds really good, and this gives us a really subtle kind of jingle when we're playing in the center of the drum, and then when we move to the rim shot, everything suddenly comes to life and we get a lot more response from the jingles all the way around. In my experience, a lot of the products like this have, generally speaking, kind of colored the sound of the drum in a way that wasn't my favorite too, and sort of turned it into a different drum, even compared to if we would just have a ring on there in the first place. So getting to experiment with this and having it not take you so far away from the previous sound is probably the best thing about the experiment that we did today. In getting to experiment with this today, we also discovered that it behaved in really interesting ways at lower dynamics with rolls and more sort of snare-oriented grooves. It took us in some different directions that we weren't necessarily expecting beyond what you might think you would be buying something like this for in a store. There's a lot of options when you have this dynamic range with something like this, where you can actually get so low to the drum and so dynamically quiet that you're actually not activating them. And then as it grows, you can get more and more sound out of it, and it becomes less of a modifier of the drum and more of its own instrument. As we branch out from drum set music and into other musics that exist in the world, it's also worth noting that there's a lot of Middle Eastern and South American musics that utilize frame drums that contain things like this, ricks and panderos and things like that, where you can get into a whole other wealth of kind of world music sounds with this simply by turning the wires off. As we got kind of finished with our complete jingle ring today, we sort of looked down and discovered that we had some parts left over, which was kind of exciting. So we decided to make a smaller ring with all the jingles on one side. Let's hear what that last groove sounds like with this added to the hi-hat. Now, the first thing you may notice is that these are not evenly spaced at all. And this stems from experiments that we did over in the Cymbal series on our Patreon. Go check it out. That really showed us that the placement actually influences the sound a lot, and also that anything that's jingling, you can put it anywhere you want. You're not limited to having them even. You're not limited to a certain number. You're not limited to them all being the same material. The world is wide open with things like this. And right here, I mean, this just took us a couple of minutes and we got super inspired and had a ton of fun with it. Something as simple as having the jingles offset also means that if you want to hang it on the ride cymbal, or if you want it away from you on the hi-hat, and you can tip the cymbal away from you to make sure that you're not hitting the jingles, there's all sort of mechanical things that can go into making little choices like this that, you know, if you don't like it, you can take it apart and try something else. This also leads us to a super important point, which is that you don't even have to use tambourine jingles for this. You can use literally anything just that you can drill a hole in, basically, and find sounds for yourself. Greg Keplinger, one of my personal heroes and a very dear friend, has been doing things like this for years, making rings and attaching things to stuff and just making things out of scrap metal. And those sounds are so inspiring because they were not preconceived. They were just experimented with, put together, and then you have the sound, and then you can decide what you want to do with it. All right, that about wraps it up. Thanks so much for coming with us on this journey. We had a blast today. Please like, comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell below so you hear about all of our new videos here and on the Patreon. Please go check out the Patreon. It is keeping us going here. We are super inspired. We want to know everything about what you're doing, and that is the place to get in contact with us and see all of the extra content that we're making here as well, including the Cymbal series, which we are monumentally excited about. Lastly, if you make things like this at home, we would love to know your process, what you use, and particularly if it's unorthodox things. If you're over regular jingles and you're making your own stuff, we would love to know.